How is the new military appreciation process evolving? We look at the new decision-making and planning process.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special podcast episode, our first cross-post from the excellent team at The Cove. This is a very important episode. It's a recording of a recent presentation from Major General Krause, the author of the new Decision-Making and Planning Process publication. This replaces the JMAP and MAP PAMs. Amongst many of the key changes that have been made, it defines the role of the commander and it strives for timely decision-making. This is a recording of a PME session that was hosted by 5 Brigade. And Major General Krause has a PowerPoint presentation that he refers to. So I've also included a link to a YouTube video. I will also include a link to the Cove podcast. They've done some excellent podcasts recently, including Australia's Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Darwin by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young, and The Future of Warfare with Jack Watling. Without any further ado, I'll hand over to the team at 5 Brigade to introduce Major General Krause.
Good evening to those online. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Simon Roeder. I'm the Chief of Staff at Headquarters 5 Brigade. This evening I've got the privilege of hosting Major General Krause and also Commander of 2nd Division, Major General Burr. 5 Brigade is convening a PME activity. It will be the new version of what many of you will be familiar with is the JMAP. Essentially the name has changed to Decision Making and Planning Processes. The author behind this is Major General Krause. I'll introduce him now. Major General Krause, AM, graduated from Royal Australian Armoured Corps in 1983. He undertook all his junior regimental appointments in the 1st Brigade, mainly in 2nd Cavalry Regiment, where he served as Adjutant, Officer Commanding Bravo Squadron, and as Commanding Officer 2000 to 2001. He commanded 1st Brigade 2008 to 2009. And I'll keep this quite short. Major General Krause's staff appointments include service in Defence Headquarters as Military Assistant to the Deputy Chief of Army in 1996, and it was inaugural Chief Staff Officer Operations to the VCDF, Vice Chief of the Defence Force, when that position was also CJOPS in 2004 and 5. In 2010, he served as the Director General Plans, J5, at Headquarters JOC, and in 2012 as head of the US Force Posture Initiative. I had the privilege of working with Major General Krause in 2016 and 17 at Headquarters Forces Command, where he was instrumental in working alongside Lieutenant General Ash Power in supporting both Exercise Hamel down in Whyalla and then also at Talisman Sabre 17. It's a privilege to have you here tonight, sir, and I'll hand over to you right now.
Simon, thank you very much. That's very kind. So in summary, what Simon said, I'm regular officer for 34 years and now a proud reservist like you. And it's great to be back in Holsworth. It's changed a little bit since I was here as Adjutant 2nd Cavalry Regiment in 1990. So as a reservist, Simon said, I do a lot of mentoring. So I mentor Commander 7 Brigade, mentor the plans area in the division, but I also write doctrine. It's not what I joined the Army for, but the previous CDF General Campbell, previous CJOPS General Bilton, reached out to some of the senior, older officers to try and capture what we've learned over the years and put that in our new doctrine. So the new doctrine is here, Decision Making and Planning Processes. Tonight, I'm not going to read it to you. Okay, I will if you like, and I'll do it very, very slowly. But instead what I thought I'd do, this presentation go for about 40 minutes, I suppose, and it's really about the why. All of you have been trained in a planning process, the MAP. Some of you may have touched the Joint Military Appreciation process. This is the new doctrine that replaces it. And what I want to do is talk to you about why it was changed and the key changes to it. So, as I said, they're the 2 doctrine publications that have now been replaced. The MAP, which all of you will have been trained in some part of, and the JMAP, which, as the imaginative title suggests, is the joint version of the MAP. So what it looks like now is the decision-making and planning processes. And part of this journey, if you like, is why it's not called JMAP 2.0, why it's not called MAP 2.0, but it is actually about decision making and planning processes. And I'll show you how I got there. Okay, so they're the 4 planning processes that we teach in the military. Okay, JMAP bottom right. You would have all in your initial employment been taught the combat military appreciation process, and then you probably would have gone on to the IMAP and then the staff military appreciation process itself. What you are probably not taught is that they are particular types of planning processes. But we teach them as a generalist planning process to solve all problems. And that's part of the problem, that these processes don't solve most military problems. And I'll get to it. So we started using the MAP about 30 years ago, okay, when I was at Staff College, as some helpful lieutenant pointed out to me last century when I was at Staff College. The social science around decision making in those days was quite different to the social science that we now understand how people make decisions. But the MAP reflects what or how we thought people made decisions. We thought that all decisions were made rationally by people, that it was based on a deep analytical understanding of a problem, and that humans were rational and were able to make decisions, ideally while smoking a pipe, probably sitting on comfortable chairs like you are now. So that was the basis of the MAP. It was what's called a rationalist, analytical, reductionist process. And it's a very, very good process if certain conditions are met. But if they're not, it's actually not a very good process at all, and we need different ideas. So I got to that stage, but at first I thought it was just a case of putting together the MAP and the JMAP. Now you might ask why I wasn't asked to put together the Air Force equivalent or the Navy equivalent, and the fact is they just don't have one. Now that's not having a go at them, they just don't need one. Whereas we plan down to section level. We trust lieutenants to make decisions in the field. That just doesn't happen in the other services. Okay, so they don't have an equivalent of the MAP. We do. So the new process, there's 2 of them. That's why it's called processes in the PAM. The first one is what's called the immediate decision-making process. And the second, which largely replaces the MAP and the JMAP, is called the deliberate military appreciation process. The difference between the 2 is that the DMAP is an analytical reductionist process like the former MAP, but the immediate decision-making process is an intuitive decision-making process. And what we're teaching people now is to have faith initially in your intuitive response to a problem. And for those with short attention span, including my mates online, the bottom line is that we're going to teach you both. And the key is to understand the value of both processes and use both of them depending on the situation. Okay, so MAP, JMAP, very, very similar processes. On the right there is the DMAP. Now, there is a step missing from the DMAP that used to be in the MAP. And that is the final step, which is the decision step. Now, that's not because this is designed for Canberra in order not to make a decision. The key thing here, that as a commander, you will make decisions at any time, and ideally as early as possible in the process. You do not wait to the end. As soon as you can make a decision, make a decision. Okay, and the decision in this case is the course of action to be executed. That's an important step forward. You don't wait to the end of the process. As soon as you can make a decision and act. Okay, so specifically what's changed by step. In the scoping and framing, we are introducing a thing called staff estimates and running staff estimates. You're going to hear a lot about that in Army now. In simple terms, it starts with a status report. So if you're the 4, for example, you should have at your perfectly formed fingertips the logistical state of your unit, or in this case of the brigade or of the division. If you're the 3, you will start the process with the status and location of your units. Okay? And it's called a running staff estimate because it changes as they change. So you will actually bring that to planning. It's a key input to planning. Okay, mission analysis, there's no separate facts and assumptions. You don't have to beat yourself up coming up with all your facts and assumptions as a single step in the process. You do that continuously anyway. So now it is a running process through the whole thing. FASD, which you'd be familiar with as screening criteria, I have added 2 new screening criteria, and they are deception and adaptability. So a course of action is not workable now if you have not considered A, how you will deceive your adversary, and B, how you are protecting yourself against deception. It's not an afterthought just before you brief your boss. It's a critical part at all times in a COA. And adaptability is basically what next and what if. So it stops you from running off the end of your plan. How many shoots have you done, or how many tactical problems have you done where you just focus on the current problem? You finish the current problem and you go home, okay, or go to the mess. Okay, in this case now, you are forced to say, in this COA, what happens if? What if there is no enemy on that hill? What will you do? What if the enemy counterattacks you after you do this? So it forces you to think ahead. And as part of that thinking ahead, you then have to take actions. So I will put that screen out in case I'm counterattacked at that point. I will push the limit of exploitation out in case I am successful. So you're not just solving the current problem, you're thinking ahead to the next. And now that is part of whether you have a workable COA or not. Have I thought what if or what next? Centre of gravity, I had to play with centre of gravity because I like centres of gravity, but instead of just being an intellectual finger painting, you then have to also express it as a defeat mechanism. In other words, I've done all this intellectual thought, what does it mean? And the defeat mechanism is a practical way of saying this is how I'm using centre of gravity in order to either preempt, dislocate or disrupt my adversary. COA concepts used to be the first part of the COA development point. It's now the last part of mission analysis. So funnily enough, it's the thing you talk to your commander with in the MA brief. So the MA brief is now no longer, sir, ma'am, we think your mission is this. Yeah, good, thanks, numbnuts. I'll figure that out. What I want is some analysis. Okay, so instead of the brief being a history lesson of what you've done, it's now about what you are going to do next. And the best way to do that is to talk about the concepts you propose to take forward. And it's either from the staff to the commander, or it's the commander to their staff. The way we too often teach this is as a staff-led, commander-approved process. That's gone. The commander is responsible, but I'll come back to that. And finally, course of action development and analysis may be combined. When there's only 3 of you sitting around the table, you don't do some stately war game afterwards. You just do it at the same time. Okay, so it gives you permission to do that. Okay, so there is an example of an MA back brief. It's actually what you propose to do next. And this can either be drafted by the staff. Now, to be able to do that, you've got to do a lot of mission analysis to do it. But the key point now is analysis, not read back to your commander the green. Okay, you actually have to do some analysis to get to there. Or the commander may come into the staff and say, develop that. Adaptation post-HA. As I said, that is now a screening criteria. Okay, and there's a whole chapter in the PAM now on adaptation. There wasn't previously. There is now. And those 4 steps that I've indicated there in the orange and green boxes, it forces you to look at likely vulnerabilities. Now, a likely vulnerability, an example of that might be, I've identified an enemy force that is not in my area of operations yet, but could be during the next period of time. I'm going to do something about that. Even though it's not in yet, it might be, I'll put a screen or at least some early warning out in case, because I've identified that as a likely or possible vulnerability. An uncertain vulnerability, without getting too Rumsfeldian about this, how do you identify an uncertain vulnerability? Well, everything you do in combat in particular is actually assumption-based. So even when we've identified a platoon in a town, for example, an enemy platoon, and we say we're going to attack it with a company to get our 3-to-1, you really don't know. So you might say, okay, I'm going to cover that vulnerability, that possible vulnerability, by positioning my reserve or allocating additional artillery. You can see adaptation is all about what if. I'm not just solving the current problem, I'm predicting, thinking ahead. A likely opportunity might be during my planning, I've identified that that bridge is really important. I'm not going to wait to the end of my planning, I'll seize it now. So I can also act before my plan is over. And an uncertain opportunity, as it says in that word exploit, what if when I attack there's no enemy on that hill? Okay, I want my force and the way I brief my subordinates for them to have the flexibility to take advantage of that. I don't want to restrain by just thinking of the current problem. So that whole chapter on adaptation is what if, what next? Okay, so that's the DMAP as it stands at the moment. Okay, so I was pretty happy with that. I went back to my commanders, that guidance from commander stuff, went back to CDF, and CJOP said, I'm really happy with what I've written. And they said, have you included the role of the commander? And I said, no, I probably should do that. Okay, because if you remember in the MAP, it's got one little paragraph in there that says the commander can abbreviate this process, the commander can do this depending on time, and it never tells you how. This new PAM does. So I'd merged the MAP and the JMAP, pretty proud of myself, but I needed to emphasise decision-making rather than planning. Unless you're at Staff College, you don't just plan for the sake of planning. Okay? You plan in order to make decisions. So I thought I'd better write about decision-making. You needed to put the commander at the centre. It's the commander's plan, not the staff's. The staff serve the commander, not the other way around. And of course, how does the commander does not use a collective planning tool. They use an individual planning tool because they're individuals. And it became very obvious in my research that there were other planning processes that we needed to teach, particularly for individuals who either didn't have a staff or for a commander so they could brief their staff. Okay, so needed a range of processes, but ideally a broad range of options that stress the value of intuition and analysis. So I then went back, and this is the next big step. Commanders, direction and guidance. There is a whole chapter now on what the commander does as part of the planning process. And it talks about decision making. That's a great quote from Monty. I don't actually like him as a person, but I like his quotes. They're really good. Okay? The role of a commander is to make decisions. So I talk about decision making in the PAM, what it means. I talk about uncertainty versus time. You will always be uncertain in combat, always. Okay? If you chase perfect certainty, you will burn time. Okay? The analogy I like to use, and I don't know if you've ever bothered seeing these videos, is, have you seen those commercial liners where people launch drones off them and wave at the drone and get great footage, and then when they tell the drone to come back to the ship, it crashes into the wake behind the ship because it goes back to where it was, not where the ship is now. Now, look, it amused me, but the point there from a planning point of view is the situation always changes, and the more time you take chasing perfection, chasing certainty, the further the ship moves. So you may actually end up planning, if you take too long, for an historical event. So one of the key things the commander has to do is determine how they will use time. Because remember, every bit of time you burn, not only does the ship move, but that's time that you're taking from your subordinates. As a general rule, act. You're never going to solve uncertainty. Okay, I talk about complexity versus complications. For those of you who are old enough and remember old watches, as he points to his Apple Watch, which my daughter bought me, think of a classic mechanical clock with cogs and springs and all that type of stuff. They either work or they don't. Okay, they only work in one way. That's not good planning. Consider instead chess, which is actually a quite simple game, but apart from that stupid rule about the pawn, chess is infinitely complex, but it's actually very simple. That's what you've got to aim for with your plan. Okay, if your plan only works one way, it is a highly vulnerable plan. It's got to have multiple ways of getting, and it's got to take into account change, both threat, opportunity. And finally, bias. I'm not biased, but some of you might be. All right. It specifically warns that bias is a very, very normal human response, particularly under stress. Talks about things like availability bias. One of the things we did in Afghanistan was invariably go to the tribe that spoke English. Not necessarily because they had better intelligence. It was just easier to get intelligence from them. Okay, that's availability bias. A lot of you will know about anchoring bias, where the first bit of information you hang on to really, really hard, even if subsequent information completely overturns that initial one. You'll hang on to it. It's called anchoring bias. Okay, confirmation bias is where you go looking for information that supports your initial orientation onto a problem. And you won't go looking for information that counters it. Okay, so there's lots of bias. The most important thing is to understand that it is normal. And one of the most important things as a commander you've got to do is get your staff to check your bias. One of the most courageous things you have to do as a staff is to nicely, remember, he or she writes your report, but you've got to check their bias. What you've got to do when you're a staff is have what I call creative adversarial relationship. Okay, it can't be adversarial. Boss, you're wrong. It has to be creative. Okay, but a good commander uses their staff to check their bias. Right, this model of planning. When you start planning, you're primarily looking up and out. That is, you're looking and orientating onto the problem you have to solve. You're reading the orders you've got from higher. You're getting your staff estimates in, etc. It's an up and out process. You're being as creative as possible. You're considering multiple COAs as much as you can. Okay, but multiple COAs at the top. How many COAs do we actually issue, courses of action do we issue to our subordinates? It's not a trick question. How many do we issue to our subordinates? One. It's called orders. Okay, so what you've got to do is be as creative as possible up top, but get to decision as quickly as possible with enough detail then to create the orders for your subordinates. You can see they're two quite distinct parts of planning. Staff's priority is the bottom bit. It's the detail required to execute. And I would offer that our Army does not do enough detailed staff work. Okay, we spend a lot of time doing vague CONOPs rather than writing executable orders. That's the role of the staff. So the commander guides the planning process, and they do it by issuing at any time, but particularly at the start, what I'm now calling, what the CDF's doctrine calls direction and guidance. Okay, I've used those words quite deliberately. Direction are the decisions that you have made as a commander. Okay, you've either made them or they are required by your commander. They are not open to debate unless you can't do it. Unless your staff tell you can't do it. You better have a good reason for that. But the commander also identifies the areas when they are still uncertain. And you can see that uncertainty might be because of a lack of information. You notice it doesn't say there, wait for the intelligence officer to give you more. It says prompts action. Anyone here intelligence? Excellent. Good. I didn't waste the joke there. Sitting back hoping that you'll be given information is a fool's errand. Act. Use the resources that you have to solve the problem. It might be a lack of intuitive understanding. By that I mean you might intuitively understand that you have to do an assault river crossing, but you don't do that just on intuition. That requires detailed planning. Okay, and you can see how the two processes are being used here. Start with intuition. I intuitively know I've got to do an assault river crossing here, but I will now use the DMAP to do the detailed planning of it. It might be about the optimal COA, again, using COA D to do that, or it might be about the scope of the problem. Commander's direction and guidance. Get used to that term. And as commanders, get used to going to your staff and say, stand by, some D&G. Okay, and understand how you use the two bits to drive your staff. Commanders do these things, and this is in the chapter on commander's direction and guidance. They understand and visualize, that is primarily a personal thing, but them understanding the problem is only one thing. They then got to describe it to their staff and direct their staff. If they don't have staff, describe and direct to subordinates. Okay, and remember that hourglass. Those first two bits are the up and out. Understand, visualize. The next two, the describe and direct, are the downwards. And you can see examples of direction and guidance there to staff or subordinates. Plans and orders, branches, sequels, CCIRs, COAs to be developed. Okay, they come from the commander. There are checklists in there. You don't need to read that. Just know that there are checklists in the PAM for commanders. So they can turn to this PAM and go, okay, these things are appropriate in this case. We haven't had that before. We only had that vague paragraph that says commanders do stuff. Now they've got this to help them. Okay, so the process itself that you have been taught is still fundamentally the same. It's how you use it that is different. So you can start the process at any step as a commander. If you've received a good set of orders from your superior and you've had the opportunity to give them a confirmation brief, which you should have, and you've had time to do some scratchings as a commander, you may say to your staff, I've done MA for you. We're going to start the process at COA D. You can do that. Similarly, you can stop the process at any stage. Okay, unless you're at Staff College, you don't have to do the whole process. Staff College. So, if you as a commander, at the end of mission analysis, say, that one. Develop that COA. That's it. Oh, boss, don't you want to do... No, that one. In the interest of time, we're going to I want you to develop that COA. That's it. The process stops. I've made the decision. Now the detailed staff work. So, this got me to the next thing, which is how do individuals actually make decisions? What they don't use is a rational, analytical process. Now, I don't have to go to some of your earlier times as a young officer, perhaps, when during your training, where you may not have always made all of your decisions rationally and sensibly. And I do not need examples of them. But often we will make decisions not rationally, but using a different process. So some of you will know about that thinking fast and slow that talks about systems 1 and systems 2 thinking. The systems 1 is intuitive, emotional, immediate. System 2 thinking is that rational, slow, deliberate. We use intuitive decision making all of the time. In fact, life would be impossible if every decision we made required a reconnaissance, mission analysis, 3 COAs, and then testing it. It would be impossible. Most of our decisions are intuitive. And that second thing there, surrounded by idiots, is a book I wrote after 9 years. No, just tells you that people are different. And if you treat everyone the same, you'll be disappointed. So you've also, part of this is the communication to your subordinates, making sure, remember, it's not what you say, it's what's understood. That's why there's actually science behind things like getting a confirmation brief after you've given someone a set of orders, getting them to back brief you so that you understand and get them to say it in their words. Okay, so how do individuals make decisions? Well, the analytical decision making, that center column you can see there, is your classic MAP JMAP. Okay, have a look at some of the criteria that are required in order to do analytical thought. Particularly things like clearly defined objectives, a complete understanding of the problem, Analytical decision making is really good if you had to optimize a production line. Really good for that. Okay, where it's a relatively stable situation, that it's not changing too much. You've got plenty of time and clearly defined objectives. Have a look at the right-hand column. Compare the two. Which one do you think sounds most like combat? Uncertainty, incomplete understanding, situation-based, dynamic. That's what you're going to face in combat. Analytical decision-making process, like the one you've been taught, are not very good in that situation. You've got to fall back on naturalistic decision-making. So, that's a slide from hell. Please do not read it. All that's telling you is that the two different processes, analytical, natural or intuitive, have strengths and weaknesses. And a bit like combined arms, your job is to understand the strengths of both. Intuitive response to a familiar problem. Have a read of that. Obviously insert person for man. So that's how modern I'm getting. But it's actually a really good quote. Must act immediately with little time for reflection because of past experience and training. What this is called is recognition primed decision making. Remember when I said right up front that the MAP was based on 30-year-old understanding of how we make decisions? Modern social science talks a lot about recognition primed decision making. Big word, or big series of words. In simple terms, it means that we make a decision that is accelerated, primed, informed by how we recognize the situation. Okay, and we orientate onto problems very quickly. Okay, the simple recognition primed decision is where I have identified a problem, I recognize a solution, I'm going to act. That's the simplest one. And the other ones are a little bit more complex, but I will resist a infantry joke here, but this is it at its simplest. I am cued that the situation has changed, either because I'm observing it, I've received situation report from my subordinates, or I've received a set of orders. I retrieve a pattern that seems to match the problem that I now need to solve, and I respond. Okay, so pattern matching. Let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. That's it in a nutshell. You will orientate onto problems based on your experience. It uses a library of mental images. The technical term for that are schemas. Okay, that's not the organisation stuffs our soldiers around. It's schemas, okay, to quickly orientate and determine possible outcomes. It's called pattern matching. The more experienced or better trained you are, the deeper and wider your pattern library is. So this only works if you're well trained and experienced. And some of the criticisms I've had of this is, so this means we're going to have to train our subordinates in tactics over and over again. To which I say, you're welcome. Yes, you will have to do that. If you're not doing that, what are you doing? Now, pattern matching is not just formal training. It can be things through PME. It's reading military history. When we brief you on the principles of the advance, we're teaching you a pattern that you can apply. That's what doctrine does. That's what experience does. That's what training does. We owe it to our subordinates now. It's much, much better. And this is what's going to happen at RMC, by the way, for both regular and reserve. You will not do one shoot for 5 hours. Sorry. You might instead do 30 quick decision exercises to get that pattern matching going. Summary so far, particularly for those amongst you who I recognise as lazy. Is everything you've been taught so far obsolete? No. The system or the MAP is still basically in that PAM. All I've said is that course of action development and analysis can be combined as a single step, particularly if there's only a few of you. Most of us do that anyway. The decision execution final step has gone. You decide at any time through the process. Don't wait to the end. Don't have to do the whole process, hoping magic plan will fall out at the end. Okay? but it's how you use the process that's the change. So there is a whole chapter on decision making. There's a chapter on the immediate decision making process, which is this intuitive decision making process. There's finally a chapter for commanders and their role to play in the planning. There's that chapter on adaptation. There's a chapter on plan development and execution, particularly useful for logisticians. Okay, so once the ops snobs have come up with their crap plan and thrown it at you, it now gives you the opportunity to actually make it happen. And there's a final chapter on training. So within Army now, whenever you do a plan, it will be executed. Okay, the plan will be tested in execution. Now, how we do that, it might be at some magic sim center. It might just be pushing some models around, little plastic models on a paper map. Doesn't matter. But it will always be tested and it will always be adversarial. In other words, there'll be someone else trying to beat you. Okay, because that's the only way to learn things like surprise. It's the only way to learn deception. You can't learn deception and surprise by producing a trace and saying, I'm going to achieve surprise. Similarly, you can't feel the effects of being surprised until someone does it to you. It will also teach adaptation post-H hour. Recovery from surprise is something that we need to teach our people. That resilience to come back. So, that's where we are so far. That's the first part of the presentation. I'm not going to take a break. I'm not going to take questions. I'm going to roll straight on. Okay, the next bit's a little bit shorter. This is what I gave commanders last year at the pre-command course. Make sure you remember, Joe. Okay, so part 2. As I said, by the way, there are some quite disturbing images in here. This is the first one. Okay, this is how we used to teach it. The staff would do all the work. The commander would come in as some amiable idiot, be briefed by the staff and go, that one. Okay, and then leave after asking when the next brief is. That's gone. That's gone. Commander drives it. The staff listen carefully to direction and guidance. Commander's got to give it to them, obviously, and then drives the process. As I said, I've shown you that before, but there is now commander's guidance and direction. This part of the presentation is specifically about that. That was a great image that I did not copy across, but imagine that there was a hen and a plate of bacon and eggs there. Okay, what's the difference between the hen and the pig? Thinking of bacon and eggs. Anyone?
The hen gets to live?
Yes, the hen contributes, but the pig is committed. All right? Second disturbing image. But the hen is the staff. The pig is the commander. Now be careful how you use this image. Okay? But it's now all about the commander. Whereas previously, particularly the way we taught it in our schools, it was about the staff. It was about keeping the staff amused. All right? So, another great quote from Monty. Have a read of that. And remember that hourglass. Remember the hourglass. The staff spend most of their time in the bottom of the hourglass doing the detail. Having the brilliant idea is fantastic, but it's got to be turned into executable orders to subordinates. You've seen that before. This is a commander's required involvement, and that is a slide from hell, and deliberately so. You notice it doesn't say wander in when the MA brief is. Commander's got to do all that stuff. Now, I would offer to you that you haven't seen too many commanders do that type of stuff during planning. Now, one of the problems in our schoolhouses, of course, is we don't always have commanders. And so we revert to the process. Commanders have to do all that, including taking the fight. What is missing from there is conduct personal reconnaissance. Commanders have to do that as well. Okay, so busy time being a commander. Have you ever been to an orders group where the commander stands up, reads the mission statement only, appears to be reading it for the first time, and then sits down? That's not how you command. Okay, so this is the immediate decision-making process in simple terms. Okay, the blue boxes are always done. Sometimes, if you are uncertain about what to do, you may use the techniques and steps of the deliberate military appreciation process. Similarly, if you're uncertain about how to do something, you may use COA D to do that. But if you can make a decision, make a decision. There's RPD again. When there's less complexity, less uncertainty and less time, you are decision making quickly. You will only use staff planning if there's more time, and it's the most efficient use of time. Again, how many of us have received perfectly crafted orders from a higher headquarters about 2 days too late because the staff at that headquarters have stolen all the time? One of the advantages of executing the plan is that you'll understand the value of acting early. Whereas if you know the staff planning is going to take a week because it says so on the program, or you're on a CTC staff X that says we're going to take a week, you're going to take a week because you gain no advantage by doing it quickly. That's bad training. So you as a commander, and if the commander doesn't give it to you, you've got to ask the commander of staff, how are we using time? Remember this one. This is a really useful model. As a staff, ask yourself, where are we in the hourglass? Once the decision has been made, you're into shut up and colour, which is a great phrase I got from the Marines when I was in Kabul. Okay, we're shut up and colour. We're now executing. We're now producing orders that can be executed. In the book are these prompting questions for the intuitive decision-making process. You'll notice it's a little bit easier. It reflects actually back to the tactical decision-making process that you were taught early on. Okay, I've said that before. There's checklists for commanders, and that's an example of sketching. We've got to get good at sketching, both as commanders to give to their staff and for staff to quickly sketch. That's a much more useful mission analysis brief than just going through lists of points proving that you can read. So remember, you can start and finish the process at any time. Using the whole process will be most unusual, but the only time you would use the whole process is if you're at the operational level and you might be doing a contingency plan. Okay. Resist using the whole process just in the hope that a magic plan will fall out the other end. So you have to do course of action development at least once, but it'll be used differently depending whether you're pre-decision or post-decision. If you're pre-decision, you're using the course of action development process and analysis in order to come up with the optimal COA. Once you have determined that and you're below the decision, you're now using course of action development in order to coordinate effects because the decision's been made. But there's still a lot of coordination to be done once the decision's been made. Okay, that's it. Now what I might do is take questions here, or I can give you an example of a quick decision exercise. What would you like? Questions first.
Okay, first question, sir. Can you discuss risk, including the commander's appetite to take risks, to exploit opportunities, early defeat mechanisms? And this is from Mr. Birch, retired.
One of the things we added to the MAP at some stage was this separate step of risk. The MAP is a risk reduction activity. That's what it is. The whole process is about taking risks, understanding risks, mitigating risks. When you have screening criteria like feasible, acceptable, suitable, sustainable, this is all mitigating risk. So you don't need a separate step that then says, okay, let's now look at all of our risks. Okay, I'm reminded of when on COAC we did an air assault onto the Trail Bridge, capture that bridge, coup de main. I was asked, sir, what is your risk tolerance? What do you reckon? We're doing an air assault onto a bridge, really high, okay? But I'm accepting that risk. So one of the things I talk about in the book is consciously taking risk. If you don't take risk, it is almost impossible to surprise your adversary. Almost impossible. You may consciously abrogate doctrine in order to gain an advantage. So one of the examples I use in there is, as a commander, I might say, I'm going to advance 3 Brigade before they're replenished and reconstituted. I'm doing that in order to gain a time advantage. I'm mitigating the risk by allocating them additional artillery. Okay, so I'm consciously taking a risk in order to gain an advantage. So don't think of risk as this horrible thing that you always have to mitigate. That's the nature of our job. Okay, so there's no separate risk bit in it anymore. What was the other question?
Thanks for the presentation. I was very much attracted to the intuitive nature of decision making and the ability to therefore create speed and also to utilise time more effectively. And then also I was attracted to deception now being bolted in to our course of action development. What I'd question is intuitive decision making, and then when you reflect on recognition, prime decision making, bias that comes into that without conflating bias into that, are you open more then to the enemy creating deception into you and creating that risk that the enemy will set that pattern for you in order to act in a certain way?
It's a great question. It really is a great question. I'm not saying that just because he's a fellow general, okay? So first of all, the enemy doesn't know what pattern you're going to execute. Part of deception is suggesting another reasonable pattern. Okay, so that's why deception is critical. Okay, so I've chosen quickly the pattern I'm going to execute. I'm also choosing another pattern that is equally plausible that I'm going to build into my deception. The other thing is that we talk about, and a lot of you, particularly those I recognise from COAC, will be happy that we're just looking for a satisfactory response. A satisfactory response executed quickly equals a perfect plan that we take a long time. Remember the ship. Remember the ship's moving. Okay, so as soon as you identify a suitable plan, execute it. Now, the more times you do that, the better your plan will be, so it now tends towards the optimal. But you only do that by constantly practicing. Okay, so you've got to have confidence that acting. Remember, the enemy doesn't know that you're uncertain. The enemy doesn't know that you're taking a risk. So you're playing with your enemy. Have no doubt about it. And the only way you can do that is by practicing simple games over and over again. Games can be 10 minutes long. Okay, they can be a paper map with a couple of little plastic 3D models that you've probably stolen from COAC. Do it over and over again. Now, as the commander, that's why I put that bit in about bias. You've got to know yourself really well as a commander. Got to know yourself well and have that humility, okay, cavalry officer, humility to talk to your staff and have your staff come back to you and say, boss, you always go right. Thanks. Okay, next time, that's the deception plan, because that's what my adversary will expect. It's a great question.
Hi, sir. I love wargaming.
Good.
And so your point to each time we do a plan, it's going to be tested or practiced.
Yes.
Is that leading into wargaming?
Absolutely.
And is that is it talked about in terms of the box method, the belt method, etc., in the doctrine there?
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to clarify. Yeah. We often talk about course of action analysis as wargaming. Okay, it's a really, really bad term. Only one side wins cover analysis. It's the blue side. Okay? If the red side does something that causes your plan to come unstuck, you cheat and go back. Okay? That's not a game, but that's what you do in course of action analysis. So the term wargaming, I really dislike when it's talking about course of action analysis. What I like is wargaming when they're talking about wargaming. It's extraordinary. There are a lot of really cheap commercial wargames available that are better than most of the games we have in our sim centres. Get them out and play them. Get them out and play them. That's how you learn pattern recognition. You've got my imprimatur to do it, okay? Because I've played war games since I was 14, and I got to general, right? That's cause and effect. But that's how you get your pattern matching, okay? This is where, and I'll show you some really quick QDEs in a minute that you can do in 10 minutes on a whiteboard. That's what you've got to do over and over again with your subordinates, right down to digger level, because you'll be surprised how good your soldiers are. That's when you pick your next Lance Corporal. Okay, so war game. You are authorised to spend all your money on war games. Any others? Any else want to be?
Evening, Colonel Kidson up the back here.
Yes.
Speaking here to the 2nd Division, domestic operations in and amongst the good people of Australia is a large part of our mission set.
Yes.
And absolutely, foundation warfighting is our centre line. But, sir, do any of your QDEs explore how we would go about applying the JMAP process, for example, when we're in an interagency setting and we're not necessarily acting unilaterally?
It's a great question. It is a good question. So, not yet, but they can. There's no reason why they can't. And certainly this process has been taught by General Chris Field to his area of emergency management. Okay, so it's not unfamiliar. My experience with DFAT, and I sincerely hope none of them are on the line, is that often they crave having a decision-making process because they generally don't have one. But you can expose your subordinates to, at the end of the day, it's problem solving. It doesn't matter whether you're facing a PLA division or whether you're defending in an urban area. They're just problem sets. And the more your subordinates get used to that, I wouldn't call the good people of Darwin or Tyndall a problem necessarily, but they're friction within the situation, okay? You're clever enough to do that. You're clever enough to come up with a quick problem statement and say, how would you do this?
My question is similar and off the back of Colonel Kidson's question in relation to our allies and partners.
Yes.
And how this may be more synergistic with some of their decision-making processes, or whether we've departed perhaps in some ways to some of our allies and partners, and just explore that.
It's another excellent question from a star-ranked officer. So JP5 is the US Joint Planning Doctrine. It was by my side when I wrote this. So if you're trained in this, you'll be able to sit in a coalition here. The other one I had was the NATO Planning Doctrine as well, okay, because it was one of my restrictions on my planning that it had to be joint. Having said that, and how can I say this carefully, when I was in Kabul, I was teaching the US their own doctrine because I hadn't read it. Okay, so I'm very confident that any Australian planner who's comfortable with this will be able to go into any coalition headquarters and not only be familiar with the joint operations planning process with the US or NATO planning, and probably teach them how to use the process better. Because remember, part of this training is also training the commander. If you've ever been on a US headquarters, the commander drives the process. He doesn't wander into an MA brief and pick a couple of typos. You know, they're driving the process. Okay, so it's a good question.
What are the organisational metrics you believe we must monitor to understand whether we are building more agile planners and leaders?
So within 1st Division, and you can copy this, Matt, within 1st Division, every Friday is now Fighting Friday, war game. I would offer that every parade night could start with a quick decision exercise to get those patterns. That'll be the metrics. How often are we doing pattern matching? How often are we doing adversarial games rather than sitting on a hill drawing stuff on a telk? That's the metrics.
Next question. From Warrant Officer Stollery at AUR Adelaide. Evening, sir. How does DMPP compare with our military allies' planning process around the world, which I think you've already covered off?
I have.
In a conflict, will we be talking the same language when it comes to planning?
Yes.
I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
Next question.
Tell him I'm coming down to Adelaide in 2nd week of April.
I think you've already done that, sir.
Yep.
Captain C from Townsville. How can subordinates embrace a culture of prompt decision-making when the organisation rewards churn excess detail?
Change it yourself.
Next question. Lieutenant Colonel Mick Henderson, Liaison Officer to British Army, with the emphasis on commander involvement, acknowledgement of experience and intuition, and the variables of human factors, as well as the intent to test plans against an adversary, do you see our training systems as calibrated to deliver on this?
Not yet, but they will. So as I said, cadets now will only be taught pattern matching. They will not be taught a planning process. They'll just be doing IDMP, immediate decision-making process, over and over again. Same with our Lance Corporals on Subject 1 for Corp, over and over again. Said it's much better to do 20 QDEs than one shoot on the side of a hill in the rain at Majura. Okay. COAC Elwick, many of you will have done that. That model where we actually bring in commanders, who would have thought, is now going to be done on All Corps Captain's course, All Corps Major's course. We will also train in role. So if you're a dental officer, you will not be expected to do a combat team attack. Okay, because guess what? You're never going to do one. Okay, but what you will be expected is to bring your expertise to the planning. Okay, so we're training now in role. We are not training generalists anymore. So, but there's a lot of work to do.
Last question from here. Strong Cav representation from 2 Cav Regiment, Captain Lindsay. Evening, sir. How do you think our new planning processes compare with coalition partners with a renewed focus on making decisions with the information you have at a time? Do you think partners will accept and execute our analysis of the problem if completed before their process is complete?
Yes.
And I think we've answered that.
We've answered that.
Yep. That's it for the online questions. Yep, that's the end of those. Any more questions locally? We'll take one more. RSM?
My question is implementation.
Yes.
Specifically, back in my history, I was in Headquarters 7 Brigade, worked heavily with yourself in there a few times. 2017, we were doing planning off PowerPoints.
Yes.
2018, Triple T, BMS came along with the brigade. That was a masterstroke because it limited how much we could put on there, and it really improved.
And I also refused to look at PowerPoints, if you remember.
Yeah,
that helps too.
So that really sped up the decision-making or every process, really, as part of the orders process. So in line with that, are we linked in, is the products linked into that now?
Yeah, so SitAware reflects this now. Okay, it's not, will reflect. You can use SitAware now to do this process, because remember, the process itself is fundamentally still the same. It's how you use it and where you start. So SitAware will still work. I think it's not a big step forward. I'm sure this is happening in most units anyway. But what we've got to do is how we plan in barracks needs to be the way we plan in the field. Okay, you can't have 2 separate planning. It's just a waste of time. We don't have time for that nonsense. Okay, so yeah, it is one of my, jobs, responsibilities is to get out. So we were at LWC 3 weeks ago. There were your staff there, Matt. So every instructor was there. Okay, it's going to take a bit of time to roll out, but the decision was made by Forces Commander last year, Brigadier Drunkowitz, roll it out across the whole of Army now. Just do it. Okay, hey, for all of you, thank you very much. For those online, thank you. Thank you for your excellent questions, Mick. And I'm always available. You can find me on DPN at any time if you need some help, writing some QDEs, etc., etc. Okay, thank you very much.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.